Thank you so much, Chairman Cole, and thank you to all of the witnesses for your testimony here today. And as you're aware, the Biden administration has made it policy to force Americans into a future comprised of electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbines, and other trappings of Democrats' Green New Deal visions of America. President Biden's goal specifically calls for a 50% of all new vehicle sales to be electric by 2030, the deployment of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, plus another 15 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Moving forward with nearly $5 billion in growing and solar energy investments. And as you know, the U.S. is currently a net importer of all of the key resources needed to power this vision, such as rare earths, cobalt, lithium, manganese, and others. In the case of some, we are completely reliant on foreign sources. Dr. Scissors, to clarify, China is the -- one exporter of rare earth minerals, correct? Yes. Thank you.
I should say it's the #1 exporter of refined.
The refined. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. And just to be specific, China accounts for 63% of the world's rare earth mining and 85% of rare earth processing and 92% of rare earth magnet production. And meanwhile, here in the United States, we have only one operational rare earth mine, California's Mountain Pass mine, and the extent of our most recent activity under this administration has been to sign an executive order to review the shortcomings of America's domestic supply chains for rare earth, or in other words, just another study, and announce a $30 million research initiative into how best to source domestic rare earths, and we created a fact sheet. So that's a study, some research, and a fact sheet, all to explore and retell a problem that we know exists in a very big way. So I'd like to pivot here a little bit. One of the key metals for EV batteries is cobalt. Dr. Scissors, as you probably know, the world's largest cobalt reserves are located in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. One of the world's largest cobalt mines located in southeastern Congo is Tenke Fungurume, and was bought by a state-owned Chinese mining company. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. It's co-owned by two state-owned Chinese companies, so it seems like there's a partnership, but they're both responsible to the state.
Okay. Could you please elaborate for me how China's domination of cobalt and other rare mineral sources in Congo and elsewhere could create or is already creating a coercive situation for the U.S. as we pursue this battery-powered future charted by this administration?
I can do a little bit of that. I will say there's a quick parallel to be made here that I think we're all familiar with, which is that Europe has been very aggressive on green energy targets, and it sort of took to them like, we don't want to have fossil fuels being produced in Europe anymore. That led them to be dependent on what? Russian natural gas. And so we had this, we're outraged at the invasion of Ukraine, we're opposing sanctions, but oil and gas sanctions need to wait, we need to wait. That was not an ideal outcome for European foreign policy, in my opinion. So, a lesson for the United States is don't get ahead of yourself. It's great to have whatever goals you have, and I'm not going to comment on the goals. I'm going to respond to your question, but you can't act like the goals are here and you haven't prepared for it. Just like chips, if you want to expand domestic semiconductor production, you don't expand it by becoming more reliant on the Chinese. That puts you in a place where you can be coerced more rather than less. On the EV battery side, the Chinese are the dominant EV battery producers around the world. The final product, they have, because of that domination of the final product, sought to reach out and control graphite, cobalt, you name it, reserves everywhere, certainly including cobalt in the DRC. The general advice for the U.S. government is, if you think this is important, you need to look at the whole supply chain. Otherwise, we're putting ourselves, to the topic of the hearing, in a position where we will be coerced. We have this nice goal, except what it's going to lead to is the goal is dependent on the goodwill of resources controlled by China. That applies to semiconductors, applies to EV batteries, applies to a lot of situations. Don't put the goal, get out in front of yourself and let yourself be coerced more. I will say one final remark. We think DRC is the dominant source of cobalt. We don't look for most minerals in the United States. So we don't actually know what our true rare earth reserves would be. what our true graphite reserves would be because we don't look. And the reason we don't look is it's not economically practical to mine them. If I had a company to do this and why don't you go look for these reserves? I'm like, well, I'm not going to be able to mine them and make money. So, I would at least like to know what the true situation in the U.S. is with regard to mineral reserves. That doesn't oblige us to do anything. But if we don't know our true situation because we don't explore, we're in a situation where the DRC has a grip on cobalt. And it is, the Chinese are heavily embedded in Democratic Republic of the Congo, having some foreign policy problems, but we don't even know what our options are. So general point, think about the whole supply chain before you jump ahead in your goals. And specific point, let's find out what our mineral reserves availability is here.
Very good. You wanted to add something as well?
Yeah, thanks, Congressman Langworthy. This is a critical issue, right? We're transitioning under mandate from the federal government at this point, a huge amount of our vehicles, states are doing it as well, to electric vehicles. There's an effort afoot to shift 174,000 non-tactical DoD vehicles to all electric by 2035. I mean, you think about it, you say, well, it's not tanks, fair enough, but all the supplies that supply all the material will be completely reliant on a supply chain that turns on China. Take cobalt, for example. Happen to know a little bit about it, serving the advisory board of a U.S. strategic metals company that's actually mining cobalt here in the U.S., refining it here. And what we've identified is that you're right, 70% of the world's cobalt roughly comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. 80-90% plus the world's cobalt is processed in China. Even the cobalt identified in the West, in the U.S., elsewhere, goes overseas to China for processing before it comes back to be put in these electric vehicles. We have got to develop capacity here at home and in our allies to both mine it, but also to refine it. And this is a critical issue. If we're going to make this transition, and there are a lot of reasons why the transition doesn't make sense at this time, but if we're going to do it, we cannot be reliant on the Chinese. If they cut our supply of cobalt off, then they decide we're no longer buying electric vehicles from ourselves, we're buying the vehicles themselves from China. That is a net negative, and if we do that for our DoD non-tactical vehicles, we're putting ourselves in a world of hurt.
100%. Mr. Jaffer, could you elaborate on the current debt trap that many sub-Saharan African countries find themselves in with Chinese state-owned banks, and what have been some of the consequences of the so-called debt trap?
Well, this is just another tool of economic coercion. The Belt and Road Initiative by China looked like a development program, right? But in a lot of ways, it has become a trap for these nations. They are taking on huge amounts of loans from China for these infrastructure projects. The Chinese expected to get them repaid. Some of these countries are having challenges, not surprisingly repaying them, and they're now extorting them for other changes, whether it's policy changes, additional loans, right, extortive interest rates, and the like. And so what looked like a development program and what at some level was a resource extraction program and a job program for Chinese nationals. I mean, remember, when China goes to a country and they provide loans to build a port, they're not using domestic labor. They're bringing in Chinese labor to work at these facilities, and then they're extracting resources, and then they're charging the country for the benefit of having created this infrastructure. And so these nations are now starting to wake up to the reality of the Chinese debt trap, the reality of the Belt and Road Initiative. The challenge is what options they have. Is the U.S. there, our allies there, ready to make commitments and make investments at the scale and scope of the Chinese government? The truth of the matter is we aren't and we haven't been. The answer can't just be, though, U.S. foreign aid. It has to also be us priming the pump, providing incentives to U.S. companies to go invest abroad and provide the kind of low insurance and political risk insurance that we need to allow U.S. companies to go to these nations and engage in the kind type of commerce that they need and can benefit from that isn't at the extortive processes and debt trap of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative.
Extremely insightful testimony. Thank you. And I think it's clear that this administration, through its push towards dependence on EVs and solar and wind energy, with no eye towards expanding extraction, something House Republicans included in H.R. 1, is complicit in a new imperialism taking hold in sub-Saharan Africa by the Chinese. Chinese economic coercion is not just directed at the United States, it's directed at countries far less developed, far poorer, and far less capable of resisting coercive tactics. And what's worse, though, is that our rising dependence on these minerals and resources to power a Green New Deal appetite and future, we are complicit in these coercive tactics. We're now looking ahead to a new era of misery and stolen economic future for millions as Chinese-run state companies with concessions and other carve-outs extract the rare earth minerals America will be ever more reliant on in the coming years on our current trajectory. China's behavior in Africa and Southeast Asia, it represents a new era of imperialism by a nation that has learned from those who once colonized it. Push countries into indebtedness and economic reliance, then extract resource concessions with little to no benefit for the local economy, and then use the indebtedness and economic concessions as an excuse to seize assets and expand military and political influence. This isn't the multipolar future that many in the developed world have spoken for or hoped for, and it certainly isn't the rules-based international community underwritten by the U.S. that has allowed for greater levels of freedom and prosperity than any other time in our world's history. I share the sentiment of my colleagues here today that it's far past time that we take China's global coercive tactics seriously, and it starts with pushing back on disastrous green energy agenda brought here by the Biden administration, relying on these Chinese-sourced lithium, cobalt, and rare earths. And this administration has to be pushed back on because they have shoved this onto the back of the American people. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for having this hearing, and I yield back.